Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video and welcome to a full tutorial on how to test your applications in React using Vite. If you're building React apps using Vite, you might be looking for a smooth and lightning fast way to test your components. That's where Vitest comes in, and I'm going to be teaching you guys how to set it up with React testing library and how to write effective tests for different types of components. I'm going to take you guys directly from just rendering simple components and simulating user interactions to test them, to then teach you guys how to test components while mocking data that is being fetched from an API, and also testing custom hooks in case you want to have them in your application. And if you want to check out the entire code for this video, it's all going to be in the description. And before we get into the video, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. This will tell YouTube that you enjoy watching my kind of videos, which is like the best way you guys can support the channel. So if you guys could do that, I would really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, everyone. So the way this tutorial is going to work is I have here a boilerplate code that I made with 3 different components which we're going to test in this tutorial. If you want to download this and write the tests as we go, you can do so as well, but the code that is in the description will include the tests already. So you can just delete those test files and write it as I do. So we have 3 simple components, which I think are going to be able to exemplify the different types of testing we might want to have. So we have a greeting component, which is a simple component, purely UI based with some text, and it takes in a prop. We're going to test this one. We have a simple counter component, which will allow us to test user actions like clicking buttons and stuff. It's just a normal counting app. And we have a user profile component which fetches some data from an API and displays it in the screen. So I feel like those 3 are the main types of components you might want to test. And as you scale up in your app, I feel like just understanding the basics of the 3 types of component will allow you to understand later on more advanced examples. At the end, we're also going to convert this counter component into using a custom hook, and I'll show you guys how to test custom hooks as well. So to start off, I want to say that we are running an application in Vite over here, as you can see. Testing a Vite app sometimes can be different from testing a Next.js app or a Remix app. In our case over here, we're going to be using this library called Vitest, which is a pretty popular library. It's a next generation testing framework like they describe. It is extremely powerful, and you guys will see why. To use it in our application, we're going to have to install it. So to install it, I'm going to open up our terminal over here, and I'm going to install all the different libraries that we need. First of all, let's say npm install --save dev to make them all dev dependencies. Then I want to install the Vitest library. Next, I also want to have React testing library. So I'm going to install the testing library /React, then add testing library /user event, and then add testing library /just DOM, and then finally JS DOM. We're going to install all of this, and as it is installing, we need to make some changes to our project. So the first change I want to make is I want to create a vitest.config.js file. So similar to a vite.config.js file, we're going to have one for Vitest. Now this file is going to be pretty simple. It's going to be very similar to the Vite config file. We're just going to import from Vite the define config. So define config. And below here, we want to export default define config and pass in an object with a test property. Now inside of here, we want to set an environment, and this environment will be JS DOM. Now we'll save this and we'll go to our package.json. In this package.json, we need to set up the testing command for our project. So I'm going to have here the test command, and whenever you run npm run test, we want to run Vitest. Perfect. Now I'll close this, and now we are ready to test our application. So if I were to open this up and actually just run npm run test, you'll see that it will start running our testing library, but it says that no test files were found. So if you want to test a file in your Vite React app, you want to create one file for each component you want to test. So for example, if I want to test this greeting component, I'm going to come over here and create a greeting.test.jsx. And this will be the corresponding file for this component. Now, the differential here is the .test extension to the name of the file, but this name technically doesn't have to be the same as the component name. You just name it the same so that you understand that this is the testing file for that component. So how are we going to generate this file? Well, let's first think about what are the properties of this component we might want to test. Now, it's a pretty simple component, right? It just literally has a simple h1 text saying hello, and that name over here, whatever comes after hello, depends on whether or not we get a prop or not. So if you call this component without passing a name, it will say hello world. If you call it with a name, it will say hello whatever name it is, which in this case is my name. So we got to test that functionality. So over here at the top, we're going to import a couple things. Let's import React from React. Then let's import from the testing library React. And we want to import two things. First, the render function, and then the screen function. Then we want to import the component we're testing. So let's import greeting from greeting. Now, finally, we want to import the different functions that we're going to use from Vitest to describe our tests. So let's say Vitest over here, and let's import both the describe, the it, and also the expect functions. Now, if you've worked with React testing library or any other, or Jest or any other testing library in React before, you know what they are. You structure your tests the following way. You describe what you're testing. So in this example over here, we want to test the greeting component. So I'm going to describe the greeting component. And you pass in a callback function. Inside of this callback function, you can put a bunch of different tests inside of it. Now, how do you specify the tests? You use the it function. So I want to describe that the greeting component renders a default greeting, which means that this will describe the test case in which we don't pass the name to this component and it should say hello world. Then we should also make another test which should describe when it renders greeting with a name. Now, for both of these tests, we need to pass in a callback function, which will allow us to first write how this component test is going to work and what we expect from it. So what do we need to do first to make this test our actual component? Well, we need to render our component in this test. So we'll use the render function to render our component. So we'll say greeting, and we won't pass the prop that we want to test in this component. Now, after this, we want to tell our test to expect something after this component is greeted. And specifically here, we don't have much in this component to test other than the fact that the prop will have some impact in the UI. So what we can say that this expects is that somewhere in the screen, we're going to be able to see a text saying hello world. So what we can say is we expect the screen.get by text, and then we specify what test we want to get by. In this case, it will be hello world. I believe this is exactly how we typed it. Yeah. And then there's a exclamation mark. And then we need to say that we expect this condition over here to be in the document. So what we're saying here is that we're rendered the greeting component. We can get something directly from the UI. In this case, it's a text using with the text equal to hello world, and we expect that to be in the document. Let me comment this out so we see if this test works, and you can see that it fails. And the reason why it fails is because it says that there's an error, invalid chai property to be in the document. Now, this is where it gets a bit different, because the reason why it failed is because it says that there's an error, invalid chai property to be in the document. So, and this is because we need to import here at the top the @testing library just a DOM, and now we'll have access to that specific part. Now it says expect is not defined. Now this errors because it says that there's an error, invalid try property to be in the document. This is because we actually need to import one more thing. I apologize. We'll just import here from testing library JS-DOM, and then we specify Vitest. And now that to be in the document should work. Now you see our test passed, but this isn't just passing for no reason. If we change this into something that isn't on the screen, you'll see that it will fail because screen.getByTest doesn't actually, can't find this thing. And it will even give you a version of the HTML of how your component looks like, and it shows that there's nothing with that specific test over there. So we'll close this and keep it like that. Now let's test the next case, which is we'll try to render a prop into the screen. So to do that, we're going to, again, grab this callback function that comes here, and we'll just put it here. But this time, we'll pass a name property over here. Let's pass something like Pedro. Now, we'll ask the same thing, but we'll expect this to be equal to Pedro. And let's see if this works. Well, I'll just open this up, and you'll see that it does. We have now two tests that pass in one file test, in one test file. Great. We now have the basics of how testing the UI for a component works. This is, again, a very basic example. And one thing I think it's important for you to understand if you're going to test UI and just testing in general with React Testing Library is the different query selectors that you can use to get stuff in your components. So Matt, let me just take this out of here and put it like this. So obviously this allows us to get a part of our component by accessing a text, right? But there's different ways you can do it inside of this screen variable over here. Actually, I highly recommend you going to the testing-library.com from the React Testing Library over here, and they have a cheat sheet with all of the different queries that you can make. So the thing is, there's no point in memorizing all of them. I don't memorize all of them. I usually just use a couple of them. I usually just use getByText or probably a role or something like that. But the thing is, there's many ways you can specify what you're getting from your component. We just use text, but the thing is, you can put a test ID on your components. You can get by role, like a different area role that you have in your inputs. You can even query by alt text if you want to, if you're trying to get an image. So there's different ways you are able to test and get things to test in your component. But one big thing that you need to understand is the difference between a query and a get. So over here, if we said screen query by text, we could do this. Every single option of what you're getting, like get by label, get by alt text, all of that, also has a query alternative. Well, the difference is that this query by text, it will return null if no element is found, rather than throwing an error. It's very useful if you're checking that something does not exist. When in reality, the get by text or all of its alternatives will throw an error if it doesn't find any matching element in the rendered output. Now, what is the use case for each of them? Well, get by text is really useful if you're certain that an element should exist, when a query by text is if you're either testing that the element doesn't exist or if you don't know for sure. So in our case over here, we are sure that this should be like this and that this should be like this. So we are using the get by text, but in other situations, you might want to query. So this is the basics of writing a simple UI component test. Now let's go to the next stage, which is writing a test for a component that requires on dynamic values, so dynamic UI values, and also user interaction. So let's create a counter.test.jsx file, which will represent the testing file for this component. So let's copy our greetings file and paste it over here, the actual testing file. Just paste it over here because we'll use a lot of the same things. Difference is we need to import the counter component from a counter. And what else is different? Let's change the testing name to counter, and we'll delete this because, well, obviously deal with it in a different way. So what is the main thing we want to test in this component? Well, over here we have this button, right? And every time I click on this button, it will increment this value. So we want to test that when I click on this button, the user will see the value incrementing by the correct amount. So we'll probably just have one test, but if you also had like a decrement functionality or you had other functionalities, you could write other tests for those too. But let's come over here and just write an it and say that it increments counter on button click. Perfect. Now let's write a callback function. Let's first render the counter component. So let's say counter. This one doesn't take any props. Then we want to access this button over here in the screen so that we can test an interaction with it. We could obviously access it many different ways, but a great way to access buttons is by using the getByRow function. So we're gonna create a constant called button, and we'll say screen.getByRow. Now we'll say that we want to get a button, like an element with the row button. Now, how do I specify which button I want in the case where there's multiple buttons? Well, you can actually access directly what is the text inside of this button. So we want to get the button, which has a name of, and then we'll pass here some matcher, which to get the text, we'll have to say increment, then close, and then put an I over here. Now you might be wondering why we had to do it like this. Well, this is just the way you have to pass text over here to get this. But the actual text that we're accessing is the increment like you see in the button. Now, what else do we need to use in order to test this? Well, we have the button and we can simulate clicking the button, which we'll do in a second. But we also need to get the value of this text over here. However, we can't use something like get text or query by text because, well, this thing changes all the time, right? So I can't query 22 and expect it to be there. But rather, what we can do is use all of the different methodologies for accessing something inside of this component. More specifically, I want to set inside of this counter a data test ID for this p tag. Obviously, I could also get by the role of being a paragraph, but I want to show you guys this. You could set up a data test ID and set it equal to something like counter value. And now in our counter test.jest, I could just come over here, say const, the counter value, and then set it equal to screen.getByTestID and specify that I want the element with the test ID counter value. And this will give me access to this UI element over here. Now, I want to test the interaction of the user with the button and what it results in the component. So the first thing I want to test is that in the beginning, so I'll say expect the value, the counter value dot text content. So we're accessing the text content of this element, which will be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, like whatever number it is. We want to expect it to equal 0 because it starts at 0, right? Let's save this. It's running automatically. You should see that the counter component does pass this test. Perfect. Now let's continue. Now we want to test to see what happens when you click on the button. But how do you test a button click? Now we want to simulate the user clicking on this button. So how do we do that? Well, at the top over here, let's import the user event from the testing library / user event library. Then we want to say user event dot click to simulate a clicking of a button, and we'll pass in the button component over here. We do have to await this action, so we have to make this function async, and this should change the value of the text content. So when this finishes happening, we'll test to see if the number increased to 1. Now let's open this up, and yeah, it does. This is showing that the test is still working. If I change this to 0, as if nothing worked, you'll see that no, now it's actually 1. And we can continue doing this. We could test this multiple times. I can add another button click and then see that this turns into 2, and you'll see that our action is working. So this is a great way for you to test user action by using the click button. There's different user actions you can test as well. For example, the user event API could test a copy action for like copying from the clipboard. It can test keyboard clicks and stuff like that. And if you have an input, for example, in your screen, and you want to test typing something in the input, you can even call the type function and then put whatever input it is and then type a word like Pedro. We obviously don't have it in this example, but if you did, you can do that and then test what appears inside of that input. Now, this test is enough for this component, and this is the basic idea of testing user events. Now, let's go to the next example, which is the example of a component fetching data from an API. Because this is probably the most useful one, because you definitely want to test components like this, which it's hard to know the state of it based on data that you're not actually creating in the front end. So you definitely want to test this. And in this case, we're returning back a user from an API, a public API, which is this one over here. I'll put like 6, for example, and you see it does return information for a user. Now, how are we going to test this? Because if you think about it, this component uses a lot of things. It specifically accesses this fetch function inside of the use effect. So we'll have to make it such that we're mocking whatever this fetch function returns. So we'll go into our folder again and we'll create the user profile.test.jsx. And inside of this file, we want to copy, actually, let's go to probably the counter, yeah. And then we'll just paste everything inside of here again. We'll change this to, again, import the user profile from user profile instead of the counter. And we'll put that name inside of here as well. And we'll delete this whole test. So what do we want to do for this user profile component? Well, the only test I want to have is that it fetches and displays the user data, right? And this will also be an async function. You'll see why. But I want to test this. Now, before I test this, we can create a mock out of it by using the const from the Vitest library. Now, what is this vconst going to help us do? Well, if you've ever worked with Jest, which I'm not assuming you did for this video, by the way, so don't worry, you might have experienced that if you want to mock a function, let's create a function variable over here. If I want to mock one, I can set it equal to, actually, I probably shouldn't call this function. So let's say function mock. I can set it equal to jest.function, and this would basically spy or mock the result of this function or whatever we do with this function. We can do the same in Vitest by using the v instead of jest. And why would we want to do this? Well, because like I said, we want to mock the fetch API. So what we can do to do that is we can run a function that is going to run before each of our tests. And what this function will do is it will first access the global fetch API. This is the actual fetch API. And instead of running the logic that the fetch API usually runs, which is actually fetching the data and running the network request, we don't want that to happen because we're running a test. We don't want the actual network request to happen in our test. That makes no sense. We want to create a mock function that spies the fetch API's behavior, and we're going to manually have control over what it returns so that we can only test how our component responds to it. So to do that, I'm going to set it equal to a Vitest.function. And then I also need to clean it up. This is actually a good point. I want to clean it up after each of our tests. Since we're doing something before each of our tests, I want to clean it up by resetting all of our mocks because we don't want to interact with other tests. So we'll save this. And now we're able to start typing our test. So the first thing I want to do here is when we render our component, right? When we render our user profile, we'll need to pass a user ID to it, which is the user ID of the user that we are trying to test, or we're trying to see the information, right? In this case, it's this person from this API over here. So before this happens, we need to tell the testing library what it will return from this fetching function. So to do that, we can say global.fetch.mock resolved value once. And we can specify what the fetch function from this API, which is, let's say over here, the fetch function will return. So you see, it will return a callback function that is going to have this JSON function over here. Now, we then specify what will be the result of this JSON function, which in reality is going to be the data that we set the user to be. So that's kind of how the fetch API works in this sense. So what we put inside of here is actually a JSON function, and we can specify what this JSON function is going to return when called. So what it's going to return is an object, and we can put the mock object that we want to test inside of here. So let's create a mock object. So it's a user. Let's put the ID equal to 4 because it's the user ID we're putting over here. And let's put the name equal to something like John, and then the email. Let's put something like john@gmail.com. Perfect. Now we have successfully mocked the return of the fetch API and rendered a component. So that means that we can expect the user information to be in the screen, right? Well, not really, because if you look at a user profile, and in its initial state, the user is null. And then when the fetch is done, it will populate that state. So while the user is null, it will show the loading state. So we can test that by expecting that the screen.get by text, and then we'll get the loading text, is to be in the document. Now, why is that going to work? You see it passes, right? Why is that going to work? Well, because to actually test what happens when this fetch is done, we have to tell the test to wait for something to happen, for the test to be done. So we'll use this await wait for function, which what it does is we'll put some tests inside of here, and it will keep rerunning this function until and rechecking until the assertions inside of this function passes or a timeout occurs. So in our case, we want that to happen because it will wait until at least this fetch API is done for a brief second, and then we'll see the user info in the screen. So let's start by getting and testing to see if the name is in the screen. So I'll say screen get by text, and we'll test to see if the text John is in the document. So to be in the document. Perfect. Let's save this and open up. And yeah, John is in the document. Perfect. Now let's expect that the screen will get by text. And we want to get John at gmail.com-e to also be in the document. Perfect. And we should see that, oh, what happened? Oh, it failed. We should see that it failed. And this is good. I like when stuff fails while I'm recording a video because you guys can see how I debug. And it seems like I already found the issue. I typed John wrong. And this is exactly the point of why we want to have tests. Because it assures things that not writing tests wouldn't. So I wrote John wrong here. We should write it John, not Jogn. And this should now work, which it doesn't. And let me see why again. So interesting. Yeah, I like this error. Yeah, I haven't tested this before recording this video. I'm doing this on the fly. So you should see that I committed a mistake here because, and this is a good example of why you sometimes need to be very specific with your tests. Because on this first test over here, I'm getting by text John, right? But there's multiple Johns in this document. So it doesn't know which one I'm trying to check for because there's also now John at gmail.com in the document, right? Before it wasn't there because I had Jogn over here. But when I changed this and corrected, now there's two Johns, and since I'm grabbing by text, I can't it doesn't know which John I'm talking about here. So I should specify that I'm talking about the name, this specific text over here. So the header, we want to get this info and test that this is in the screen. So we can use another function instead of get by text. We use get by row. And get by row will allow us to specify that we want to get a header, so a heading, because the email is a paragraph, not a header. And we can pass a name value similar to when we did this for the button for specifying that we want John to be the name. So now we should see that the test passes, which is great. Now this is basically it for testing our components when fetching data. This one is a little bit more complicated. And one thing you should keep in mind is, in this example, we're just fetching data using the fetch API. But every single data fetching or caching library you use, may it be React query, RTK query, I don't know, GraphQL, Apollo client, whatever library you decide to use, will have its own testing standards. So you should look at their documentation. It's not that complicated to integrate, and you should see that they'll have a good explanation for it as well. So now what do? We're going to test custom hooks, which is definitely something that I wanted to include in this video because it's something I do use a lot. But before we get that, you guys might have noticed that the test that appears here in the terminal changes depending on which file I'm in. This is one of the great things about Vitest. See, if I'm in the greeting testing file, it will show the greeting test. If I'm in the user profile, it will run that one. So that's good because we can keep running our tests, and depending on what file we're working on, it will run that specific test for that file. I forgot to mention that in the beginning, but it's one of the reasons why I like Vitest. Now, perfect. Let's get into writing the code for our hook. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create here a folder called hooks, and I'm going to create a hook called use counter. So it's a hook that is going to abstract the logic that exists in this counter component, put it all in a custom hook, and we're going to integrate that hook over here. Now I'm going to skip for when I write this hook. So I'll be back in a second because the video is not about writing hooks, but I'll be done in a second and I'll be back. Perfect. So this is the hook that we have. It's a very simple hook, takes in a value. Initially, it can be 0, has the state. And I decided to also add the decrement function so we can test that one as well, but it returns everything back. This means that now over here in our counter, the JSX, instead of creating the state here, we can just call that custom hook. So we'll say use counter, and we'll call the count, call the increment, and call the decrement. And now we can replace this with just an increment function. And to be honest, I'll keep this independent from the hook, so we won't even call the decrement function. You should see that the logic remains the same, the UI remains the same, but the test for this file also continues working because the test is independent from the hook. So now we want to test the logic inside of this hook instead of testing the UI. And that's one of the beauties of creating custom hooks. I recommend that every time you create a component, and if you're interested in seeing how I write my components, I have a video that got released recently, which I talk about how I like to structure my components. But I personally always recommend you to abstract the logic from your components into a custom hook so that you can more easily test your component for UI changes and test your hooks for logic. So you're more easily testing everything in your project by separating them. So how would we write the test for this specific hook? So let's create the testing file for this use counter.test.js. And inside of here, it's going to be very similar to the other testing files that we have. So I'm just going to copy them and paste it over here. Now, the main difference is that, again, obviously, we're going to change this to use counter, and we're going to change this to use counter as well. I'll also copy this and paste it here, and I'll delete all of this. Now, I want to test 3 things inside of here. First, I want to test to see if initial value is, I don't know, let's put a value here. Let's put 5. So what I'm going to test in this test over here is what happens to the count if I pass an argument of 5 to this hook. So it's going to be pretty simple to test that. Then I want to test to see what happens to we'll test the increment, and we'll also test what happens with the decrement. So 3 different scenarios. So to do that, let's start with the initial value is 5 because it's the easiest one. Now to test this one, we need to render the hook, but rendering the hook is different from rendering a component. We don't use the render function. We use the render hook function. So with that function, we can say const equals to render hook, and we can put a callback function that will return, and we can call the use counter hook. Now this test is testing for the hook with an initial value of 5. So I'm going to pass 5 over here. And this render hook function is going to return this really cool variable called the result. This result will give us access to all of the returning values in this hook. So it'll give us access to the count, the increment, and the decrement. So inside of here, I'm going to expect that if this is what happens, the result.current.count is going to be 5. Now let's save this. You should see that it doesn't work. Oh yeah, no, sorry. This should be wrapped. And yeah, now it works. Now, perfect. Let's close this and let's start writing the logic for the increment. So for the increment, we want to deal with calling the increment function and seeing what is the result out of it. So the cool thing about testing and separating your logic and testing it in a custom hook, it's that you can directly access the functions that are returned from this hook. So inside of this, I could, for example, copy all of this, put it over here. I'll start it as 0 in this case. And I can, first of all, expect it to be 0 because that's the initial value. You see it passes again. But then I can call the increment function by using this very nifty function from the Vitest, from the testing library called act. And what this function will do is it will allow me to call and ensure that all state updates are processed before the assertion that we're going to make. So I'm going to act, and in this case, we're going to act by calling the result.current.increment function. And after this happens, we want to expect the count to be 1. You should see that it passes perfectly. We can do it again and expect it to be 2. We can do it as many times as we want, and it will work as well, as you can see. Now for the chills of it, I'll just do it for the decrement as well, but I guess at this point you guys already got the gist of it. So I'm just gonna paste this here. Let's call the decrement instead of increment, and let's just set this to -1 and this to -2 instead. And you should see that, I put -22. You should see that it works, right? So yeah, this is how I would test a custom hook. And this is great because, like I said, you're being able to test the logic without caring about how the UI looks like. And I personally would structure my project with every time I have a component or I have a hook or whatever, I'll have a folder for it. So for example, for the counter, I would have a counter folder over here like this. And I would put both of these files inside of here. So they're grouped together. And this goes the same way with routes, with whatever you're trying to test. I would always have a file and a test next to them. So this is basically it for the video. We covered a lot of things. We covered how to set up testing in your Vite application. We covered, from basic testing of UI and props and stuff, to having user interaction, to testing fetching operations, to even testing custom hooks. So I'm really excited for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment which one to see next. If you want to check out more of my videos, subscribe, because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week. I'm always looking at the comments, and I'm always trying to bring value and videos that you guys ask for. So if you want to check out the code for this, again, it will be in the description together with a step-by-step tutorial in text form if you want to check that out as well. It's going to be in my blog post, PedroTech.co. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I see you guys next time.